Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
Have you made resolutions for the coming year? Is vulnerability one of them? We'll find out why it might be the most important of all. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Most people think of vulnerability as a weakness, but we'll learn why opening ourselves up, embracing vulnerability, really requires great courage and offers even greater rewards.
Dr. Brené Brown has inspired millions with her TED Talks on the power of vulnerability. She'll tell us why stressful times like these call for authenticity, even if it's scary.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how we can improve our relationships with our partners, friends, children, and colleagues in 2015.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, reports from public health officials indicate that influenza is widespread around the country. The predominant virus causing illness is a variety of H3N2 that is not covered by the flu vaccine because its genes drifted away from last year's strain. Holiday travel may help spread infections even faster than normal. The CDC has recommended antiviral medicines, Relenza or Tamiflu, be prescribed for people who become ill with H3N2 flu. The only trouble is that there's a shortage of Tamiflu in many parts of the country. Because the drug is most effective if it's taken within the first 2 days of symptoms, a shortage during the peak flu season could leave many people without its potential benefits. Although Tamiflu doesn't cure the flu instantly, it can shorten the duration and severity.
The FDA has just approved a new antiviral drug to treat influenza. Rapivab, also known as Peramivir, is administered to adults in a single intravenous injection during the first 48 hours of flu symptoms. This means that it's likely to be reserved for hospitalized patients who come down with the flu and can't take oral or inhaled drugs like Tamiflu or Relenza. As a single-dose treatment, it is convenient. The medicine is mostly well tolerated, but it can cause diarrhea, serious skin reactions such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and also delirium and hallucinations.
Traumatic brain injury affects nearly 2 million Americans each year, contributing to death and disability. The initial trauma can trigger a series of changes within the brain. Tissue damage and cell death cause a range of symptoms that have been hard to reverse. That's why there was great interest in preliminary research suggesting that early administration of the female hormone progesterone might counteract many of the complications associated with traumatic brain injury. Unfortunately, the results of 2 controlled trials have just been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they did not demonstrate benefit. One of the studies included 1,195 patients and the other 882 patients. There were no significant gains in function between those who received progesterone and those who got placebo.
People used to read a book before bedtime to calm down after a stressful day. Now, many people use a tablet, smartphone, Kindle, iPad, or similar device to do their bedtime reading. A study from Harvard suggests that it's probably a bad idea and could disrupt sleep. The scientists recruited 12 young adults for the study. They read for 4 hours before bedtime for 5 days. Half were reading e-books, while the other half had print books. After 5 days, they shifted to the other format for an additional 5 days of the study. Those reading e-books took longer to fall asleep and said they felt less sleepy. During sleep, they dreamed less, and they felt groggier upon waking. Blood tests showed that electronic reading delayed the normal nighttime peak in melatonin levels by more than an hour and a half. The scientists suspect that the blue light waves that e-readers emit trick the brain into perceiving that it's not yet nighttime. Since nearly half of U.S. adults keep a smartphone or tablet near the bed, this could be contributing to the national sleep debt.
Obstructive sleep apnea affects tens of millions of Americans. In this condition, the airway is briefly but repeatedly closed off, leading to gasping or snoring as a way of reestablishing airflow. Sleep apnea can complicate conditions such as hypertension, heart disease, or diabetes. It may affect as many as 5% of adults, and it's especially common among older people and the overweight. There are no medications for sleep apnea, but it's treated with medical devices. Most common is the CPAP machine, providing continuous positive airway pressure. Some people are treated with a mandibular advancement device, which moves the lower jaw forward to improve breathing through the mouth. A meta-analysis of 23 studies found that CPAP treatment alleviated symptoms of depression as well as sleep apnea. People who were depressed at the beginning of the study got the most noticeable response. The investigators suggest that doctors will need more research to select the patients who will benefit most from sleep apnea treatment. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Are you looking forward to the new year with anticipation and excitement? Or are you worried about uncertainty and feeling vulnerable?
To learn why vulnerability is really a strength instead of a weakness, we turn to Dr. Brené Brown. She's a research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. Her books include The Gifts of Imperfection, I Thought It Was Just Me, and her most recent book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to Be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Brené.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with y'all. Thank you.
Brené, this is the time of year when people, they look back over their lives, they assess how the year went, did they live up to the resolutions from last year, and they often conclude, not good enough. I need to lose more weight. I need to exercise more. I just need to be better in every way. And then along comes January and February, and we fall off the wagon again. You've been studying this whole issue of shame and fear in our culture for a very long time. Why do we get into these ruts that we can't seem to get out of?
Well, I think the best place to, answer this question is to look at the big picture first. I do, when I'm asked to describe the culture, this is the 12th year of my research. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm really kind of boots on the ground with folks talking about their experiences and their lives. And one of the things that I have really found in the last decade especially is that we live in a culture of tremendous scarcity. We live in a culture kind of defined by never enough. You can fill in the blanks, never good enough, never thin enough, never perfect enough, rich enough, powerful enough, loved enough, promoted enough, extraordinary enough, certain enough. And it's interesting because I started just kind of coincidentally my research about 6 months before 9/11. And I really watched over the last, 12 years how fear has really run roughshod over our families and our communities and our organizations. So I do think there's kind of this entrenched sense of never enough. And then any new beginning, a new birth, a new partnership, the new year is always a reflective time for us. We look back and we think, what have we done that we wanted to do? What have we not done? What have we done that we didn't want to do? And I think we look back very critically at ourselves, and we focus very much on what we didn't get done as opposed to what we did well, what brought us joy. It's that classic experience that I think we've all had where we sit down for a performance appraisal or something and, we hear, 50 great things we're doing and one thing that we could do better, and that's the only thing we obsess on for, weeks. I think we look at our lives the same way, and I don't think it's productive. I think there's a very, as you mentioned in your question, a very powerful relationship between expectations and shame. Shame is that intensely painful feeling that we're not good enough. It's very universal. We all have it. It's the most primitive human affect or emotion that we experience. The only people who don't experience shame are people who have no capacity for connection or empathy. So we all have it, and we all wrestle with it. I call it the gremlins. It's the never good enough gremlins. And so I think as we start the new year, what's incredibly, I think, helpful and productive and constructive is to look back and think, what did I do really well last year? What am I proud of? Where did the joy come from? And I think about, as an example, my husband and I sat down and a couple of years ago, and we made a list of the specific choices and behaviors that we were making, engaging in when we were the most joyful in our lives. And it was completely surprising to us because it had nothing to do with earning more and buying more and acquiring more. What we found is that we were the most joyful when we were in a place of gratitude, which I think not only my data bear that out, but I think research around gratitude globally really points us to the fact that gratitude brings a lot of joy into our lives when we're practicing gratitude. But also it was the small things that we found when we were cooking more, sleeping more, connecting more. Family dinner is a really big deal for us, and when we were routinely doing that. So I would say as we go into the new year, do more of what's working well and get really clear on our strengths and how we can use those in the year coming up, as opposed to this kind of really self-critical bashing that we all engage in. It just moves us back. If shame worked and it made us thinner and healthier and happier, then we'd all be really perfect. But, it's that kind of myth that if you put the picture of yourself that you hate on the refrigerator, you won't open the door. When what really happens is you open the door and you stand there eating the tub of ice cream or the jar of peanut butter, looking at the picture and feeling overwhelmed and struggling with self-worth. It's counterintuitive, but I think gratitude and self-compassion are the way forward.
Gratitude and self-compassion sound like such good ideas, but I think a lot of people have a hard time knowing exactly how to get there.
I think it's true. And I think, as a researcher, I think if someone would have told me a decade ago, you're going to be, on the radio talking about self-compassion and gratitude, I would have been like, I'm not a Hallmark store, I'm a researcher.
Right.
I think I would have really pushed against that because they seem to be somewhere on the continuum between gauzy and flaky for me, or they used to be, until I really got into this research and realized the profound value they have in our lives. So self-compassion, I think a researcher who's done a lot of work in this area who I absolutely love is Kristen Neff. And if listeners just kind of do a search for her name, and she has a site called the Self-Compassion Lab, and she has a great instrument that you can take online. And what she's done with her research is she's found kind of 3 elements of self-compassion that when they come together give us a great indicator of how compassionate we are with ourselves. The first one is self-kindness. The second is common humanity. Do we understand that the struggles we have are the struggles of the world? And the last one is mindfulness. And I really recommend to listeners to give it a shot. I learned a lot about myself. For example, I learned that I have a real strong sense of common humanity. I think as someone who studied shame for a dozen years, I get that whatever I'm up against and whatever I feel like is weird or hard about me is other people have that sense too. But really not so great at self-kindness. And one of the things, when you talk about what's a practical application of self-compassion, one of the things I've been trying to practice lately is talk to yourself like you would talk to someone you really love. So, for example, this is a really bad shame story, but relatable, I think, for a lot of people. I got a request I do a lot of public speaking. I got a request from someone that said, can you come speak at this date? And I said, I'm so sorry I can't, because it was my son's birthday week. And I have, a first grade son and a daughter who's in 8th grade. And I'm very protective of my family time. And he shot back an email that was super mean-spirited. It was just, I thought you were, using a lot of language from my own work. I thought you were compassionate and I thought you were wholehearted, and I can't believe you're not going to come speak to us. And, and it really it really triggered shame for me because, I it's one of the big gremlins for me, one of the big shame triggers for me is kind of make everyone happy, don't disappoint people. And so it really made me mad. And so I fired off an email to my husband. I forwarded it to my husband with a note talking about what a jerk this guy was and, just cussed and ranted and raved. And, I get to have family time too. And who do these people think they are? And I hit reply.
Uh-oh.
Instead of forward. Yeah.
Undone by technology.
Oh, totally. It's like fire. You can keep yourself warm or you can burn down the barn, as we would say in Texas. So I had burnt down the barn for sure. And so, of course, within seconds I get a reply. I knew it. You're a rotten person, But I remember sitting there thinking, okay, this is what shame feels like. I recognize it. Because one of the things that people who have a lot of resilience to shame share in common is they physically know when they're in it. And I knew I was in it. Time was slowing down. My heart was racing. My face was hot. And the first thing I did, because I've been practicing this for a long time, is I said, talk to yourself like the way you would talk to your kids. And I think if Ellen or Charlie had made that mistake, I would not berate them. I would not say, God, you're so stupid. What were you thinking? You're such an idiot. I would never do that. I would say, you know what? Let's take a deep breath. Everybody makes mistakes. You're human. And so I think part of self-compassion is trying to talk to ourselves in a way that's loving and respectful. And it seems like a small thing, but I think most of us talk to ourselves in a way that we would never talk to other people. And in terms of gratitude, and so I talked to myself that way, and I did the two most counterintuitive things you do when you're in shame. Shame loves silence. Shame hates having words wrapped around it. It hates being spoken, which is why shame loves perfectionists like myself, because it's so easy to keep us quiet when we do something wrong. And so the counterintuitive thing to do when we're in shame is to reach out and tell the story, to talk to someone about what's happening. Because, shame needs three things to grow exponentially: judgment, silence, and secrecy. I always say if you put shame in a petri dish and you douse it with those three things, with judgment, silence, and secrecy, it grows exponentially. If you douse it with empathy, it can't survive. Shame cannot survive empathy. Empathy creates a very hostile environment for shame. So I talked to myself, with kindness, and I reached out and called my husband and a good friend of mine, Karen, and told them what was happening. And in those conversations really came down out of the shame and to a place where I could make choices that were compatible with my values, which meant emailing this guy back, apologizing, and setting some very clear boundaries about what kind of communication we could have going forward.
You're listening to Dr. Brené Brown, research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. She's author of Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead. Her other books include The Gifts of Imperfection and I Thought It Was Just Me.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk with Dr. Brené Brown about vulnerability and why it's so important.
We'll find out what daring greatly means and how trying not to be vulnerable can end up hurting us.
How does a willingness to be vulnerable apply in healthcare and in our communications with doctors and caregivers?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utter Cream and Utterly Smooth Extra Care Cream. Enriched with urea to moisturize dry, cracked skin. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com. toiletpotty.com.
And by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 886. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
How do you deal with uncertainty and vulnerability in your life? Some people overeat. Others overspend or drink to excess. We're talking today about why we should embrace vulnerability instead of seeing it as a weakness.
Dr. Brené Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. We're talking today with her about her book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead.
Brené, you have focused on vulnerability in your TED Talk, in your book, and I think a lot of us would agree that, it sounds like a good idea, but there's this other part of us that says, well, we don't really want to be vulnerable. So help us understand, what does vulnerability mean and why is it so important?
I think there's so much truth in that question, especially in the part where, it sounds great. And we can almost sometimes even intellectually acknowledge that there's something powerful and important about being vulnerable. But I think one of the greatest paradoxes that I've uncovered about vulnerability is it's the first thing I look for in you and the last thing I want to show you in me. In other people, when we see people being vulnerable, we see courage. In us, it feels like weakness. And I think, just to kind of set a foundation of what vulnerability is, when we went in and asked people, give us an example of vulnerability. What is vulnerability to you? I'll share some of the answers from the research. Vulnerability is my first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is trying to get pregnant after 2 miscarriages. Vulnerability is starting my own business. Vulnerability is saying I love you first. Vulnerability is making a piece of art and putting it on Etsy for sale. It's being really excited for my son who really wants to make first chair in orchestra and supporting him and getting excited for him and sending him off to school for tryouts and knowing that's probably not going to happen. So when we looked, we took all of these examples and we came up with a very simple definition of vulnerability. I define vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And, as you think about these examples or even think back in your own life, there's just no equation where being vulnerable equals being weak. One of the examples that came up often was vulnerability is reaching out to a friend who's gone through experienced a really traumatic loss. People gave examples of calling a friend whose wife had, died of a heart attack or who had lost a child. And we all know that feeling of kind of circling the phone and thinking, I don't want to call. What am I going to say? It's going to be so hard. But we also know the feeling when we pick up the phone and we don't have anything to say that'll make it better because there's nothing that makes it better. All we can say is, I'm here. I care about you. I want you to know I'm with you in this. And when we hang up, we know we've done something brave. And so what I have found in my work is that the mythology that vulnerability is weakness doesn't pan out at all. And in fact, I think vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage. When we look back and I have 11,000 pieces of data, when we go back into the data, I cannot find a single example of courage, of moral courage, spiritual courage, leadership courage, not a single example of courage that was not completely born of vulnerability. And so even the toughest critics around vulnerability, when I ask them, what was the last thing you did that you felt was really brave? They're like, oh my God, I get it. I can remember what the last thing I did that I thought was brave, and it was so vulnerable. So I think vulnerability is, showing up and letting ourselves be seen.
Is there a time when refusing to be vulnerable, not being vulnerable deliberately, has interfered with someone achieving his or her goals?
I think that happens a lot. I mean, the title Daring Greatly is from a speech given by Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s. And, just to paraphrase it very quickly for you, his language was, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, who strives valiantly, who, knows triumph, who knows defeat, but if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. And I think this idea of going into the arena and showing up in our families, in our partnerships, in our careers, putting a far-fetched idea on the table, raising our hand in class when we just went back to school in our 50s. I think initiating a really honest conversation with our partner about sex. I think those moments of daring greatly define our lives. I think that it's very difficult in our culture today. I mean, we talked earlier in the first segment about scarcity. I think one of the things that accompanies scarcity in a culture is cynicism and criticism. And we live in a culture of what I call projectile criticism and reflexive cynicism. And so to walk into the arena and put ourselves out there to be all in feels incredibly dangerous and risky. I just don't know that it's ever as dangerous or risky as standing on the outside of our lives looking in and wondering. And when you ask the question, has it ever changed the course of people's lives? I think the answer is yes. And I get that a lot when I do interviewing around in organizations. I spent a long weekend with 50 CEOs from Silicon Valley, many of whom were very well-known disruptive innovators in their own field. And when I asked them, what gets in the way primarily of innovation in organizations and, in art and, in any area, what they said was basically the fear of being laughed at, the fear of being ridiculed or judged or, feeling blamed or shame. And they said the reason why there's such a scarcity of innovation right now in our culture is that there's never been an innovative idea put on a table where half the room didn't roll their eyes and laugh and walk out. They said you can put something that's evolutionary on the table and people will, often acknowledge that it could be a good idea. But if you want to do something truly revolutionary, truly transformative, most people will be critical of that. And so I think, from our work lives to our personal lives, when I talk to adults who are dating, online dating, real life dating, they talk excruciatingly about vulnerability and the fear of putting themselves out there, the fear of being hurt or rejected. So I think it's meaning making, and I think it's life defining.
Brené, you just mentioned CEOs. And when I think about CEOs, especially of the kinds of companies that you've been dealing with, these are people who give off tremendous sense of self-confidence and accomplishment. And in fact, we live in a culture where people are sort of, I think, rewarded for giving off those vibes. And the idea of bosses or parents giving the impression of vulnerability, it seems like an anathema, because that translates into, in many people's minds, weakness. And so how does somebody working in an environment where their boss is going to look at them a little funny if they're vulnerable, how do they overcome the fear that they're going to come across as kind of a weak person, as a person who's incapable of accomplishing everything, or in the case of a parent, showing weakness to a child?
It's interesting because one of the things I would say is, there's four big myths of vulnerability. The first one is that vulnerability is weakness. The second one is that we can opt out, that we can choose not to be vulnerable, that we can say, I don't do vulnerability. But the bottom line is, to be alive is to be vulnerable. to be, in relationship is to be vulnerable. To be at work is, constant vulnerability because there's constant uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. The third myth is that vulnerability is letting it all hang out. That, standing in front of your executive team and saying, I'm scared, I don't know what I'm doing, and, I think my husband and I are getting a divorce, and my oldest child may be using drugs, and I'm not speaking to my sisters. That's not vulnerability. That's probably lack of boundaries. Vulnerability is about sharing appropriately and sharing honestly, and it's about transparency and authenticity. What I think is that if you want to talk to folks who, when we interview people and say, tell us about the leader of your team or the leader of this organization, when people describe a leader that they would follow into a burning building kind of leader, the kind of people they're passionate about working on a team with, what we hear all the time is he or she is so real. These are leaders who stand up in front of people and may not share every ounce of their life personally because that's not appropriate because there's a mindfulness about the role you play. But these are leaders who stand up and say, I don't have all the answers. I can't move this company forward on my own. I need help. I need your ideas. I need you to show up. I need you to be engaged. I need you to give me feedback about what I'm doing well and what I need to do differently to support you. Those are transformative leaders. And that kind of acknowledged vulnerability and transparency is very contagious in organizations. So when it starts, what we see is other leaders then stand up. To me, when I go into an organization, it's very interesting when I assess how vulnerability is viewed in an organization and by, in any system. This is a family too. Are people, do people have permission to say, I don't know. I need help. I don't understand. I'm concerned. Are people willing to say, I take responsibility for that? I made that choice. Are people willing to say, thank you, I'm sorry. I'd like to give it a shot, but I'm not quite sure I know how to do it yet. And so I think leaders have to make choices about whether their self-worth comes from kind of an all-knowing superhero persona or if they're really interested in transformative leadership. And if they're interested in transformative leadership, we have to create cultures where, it's the whole idea of, failure is not an option. Well, when failure is not an option, neither is learning, creativity, or innovation. We have to make a choice. And what you see from a lot of transformational leaders around vulnerability and failure is a strong, passionate belief in productive failure. Fail fast, fail often, clean it up, learn from it, move on. And the willingness to share their own struggles. And so I think, honestly, the tide is turning around this. I think that impenetrable, I've got everything going on, I'm perfect. Not only does that breed distrust, because we know, we all know that doesn't exist in the human experience, it also breeds disengagement. I don't know you. I don't understand you. I can't connect with you. Therefore, I'm not inspired by you.
Brené, what this is all bringing to my mind is actually medicine as it's practiced in the United States today. We've talked about shame and blame and how toxic they can be. We've talked about the idea of having to appear as though you were perfect and the inability to admit that failure might be a possibility. So even though failing is actually inevitable in the healthcare system at some point or another, and probably at many points, there seems to be a lot of pushback there. How do these ideas relate to healthcare?
I'm sitting in Houston, about 3 miles from the largest medical center in the world, so I do a lot of work in this milieu, and I think it's an extremely critical conversation that may be beginning to happen in some places, but certainly not enough places. And my husband, full media disclosure here, is as a physician, as a pediatrician, and so we talk about this a lot. When I go in and am a consumer of healthcare, I want to be in a partnership. I want to be in a partnership of equals. I want to be in a partnership with a physician who respects how well I know myself and how I trust myself. I want compassion, and I want some mutual vulnerability and shared vulnerability. I want to, it's very interesting because my husband's practice is a little bit unique because 60% of his patients are the children of physicians or are medical professionals. And the one thing I've learned from watching them over the years is a question they ask each other often is, what would you do if this was your child? And I think what that is a real bid for vulnerability and humanity in that room. I think it's a real bid to go beyond, I understand what your advice is, I understand what you're thinking, I understand what the data are, but what would you do if this was your own child? And so what I think we're desperate for as consumers of healthcare is I want to be in the room with a real person. I want to be in the room with a person who is not only committed to my health, but committed to honoring myself as a person and as an equal partner in the process. And to be honest with you, I really said something about this, I didn't expect to say something about it, but I kind of never plan what I'm going to say, and I didn't for the most recent TED Talk on shame. But I think a lot of this starts in medical school when the environments are very shame-based. There's a lot of shame and blame, a lot of competition, and vulnerability is kind of just squeezed out of everybody. And I get the struggle because a lot of times when we're afraid and we're sick, or we've got a child that's who's afraid and sick, we don't want to see more uncertainty in the eyes of a physician. But the bottom line is we want truth. And we want someone who we can trust, and we want someone who's transparent. And I think 10 times out of 10, patients are going to trust the person who says, we don't have all the answers here. What's the most important thing right now is that we do best for you, and that you trust me, and that you know I say what I mean what I say, and that I'm with you in this. And I think that's what we're looking for.
You're listening to Dr. Brené Brown, research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. She's written several books, including The Gifts of Imperfection, I Thought It Was Just Me, and her most recent, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to Be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead.
I really love this idea of the 3 T's in our interaction with health professionals: truth, trust, and transparency.
And I like the idea of a mutual partnership with compassion.
Absolutely. Productive failure, that's okay. We have to learn from our mistakes.
We do need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk more with Dr. Brown about engagement.
Why is disengagement so dangerous? What does it mean to be wholehearted? And can adults learn about trust from their children?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339. The website, uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, You can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 886. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can find it online. It's at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today our topic is learning to engage wholeheartedly with each other. Our guest is Dr. Brené Brown, research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. She's written several books, including The Gifts of Imperfection, I Thought It Was Just Me, and her most recent, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to Be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead.
Brené, you've talked a little bit about engagement, and you write about the problems of disengagement. Can you tell us what that means and why it's so dangerous?
You know, I spent the last couple of years a lot of time, the majority of my professional time, in organizations, schools, talking with families, interviewing parents. And I think if I had to boil down what I see as the primary issue facing us today, it's disengagement. It's this idea that I'm not quite all in. You know, I've got one foot back. I'm not going to let myself care too much because there are no guarantees. And there's a little bit of this idea that it's easier to live disappointed than it is to feel disappointment. And so I'm just not going to expect a lot from myself and the people around me, and that way it'll hurt less. And I think, you know, in organizations, I think, you know, one of the things that I've seen lately around disengagement is this idea, like, just as an example, you know, we're all sitting down at the table, we're in a team meeting, and the leader says, hey, we've got a new project. It's starting in a month. This is what it's going to look like. I'd love for y'all to each own a piece of it. I think this could be a real growth potential for us. And someone speaks up and says, oh my God, this is really exciting. I'd love this piece of it. Invariably, what will happen, and it's a relatively new phenomenon, I think, is you'll see a couple people around the table go, oh God, look at her. Look at me. I want a piece of it. Ooh, I'm so excited. It's kind of the cult of I don't give a damn. And I think what's right behind that, I mean, barely under the surface there, is fear. It's the fear of being vulnerable. It's the fear of being all in. It's the fear of caring so much that we're more likely to get hurt. And I think it's also, you know, to be very honest with you, I think it can also, disengagement can be the product of really bad leadership. I think in schools today, when I talk to teachers who are, you know, struggling with engagement, they feel really up against the wall. They feel like everything has come down to standardized test scores. If they're the teacher who is willing to take some of the students who learn differently and who have challenges because they love that work and they're passionate about that work, there's a huge penalty now to doing that because it affects their group mean for their test scores.
We sometimes also hear teachers complain that parents are not engaged enough.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, I think if you ask teachers, you know, what are the biggest obstacles you face, it'll say standardized test scores that don't take children's creativity and learning into consideration, and parents. And so I think culturally we've tried to manage uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure. We've tried to manage vulnerability by, you know, creating all these metrics and really nailing down everything that's moving in order to make us feel safer. And what we've done in the process is driven the passion out of people. You know, here's one thing I can tell you, and this applies to families, and I see it all the time, unfortunately, in families, schools, businesses, and the larger culture. Shame can only rise to a certain level in a system before people disengage to self-protect. So if we've got a boss who's using shame as a management style, who is, you know, correcting us in front of our colleagues, who's putting us down, who's tying our productivity to our self-worth, that can only happen for so long before we say, you know what, I've got to disengage. In schools, the same. In families, the same. So, and one of the things that's really interesting that we found is that when we were interviewing human resource professionals and asked them, when people are leaving and you're doing exit interviews, what's the number one thing that you hear come up over and over around why people are displeased, why people are, leaving, why people are unhappy? And you know what the number one thing emerged as?
Tell us.
Lack of feedback.
Oh, okay. So one way or the other, people want to know how they're doing.
Yeah, because feedback is a function of respect. It's a function of respect when we're learning and when we're working, when we're growing up. Feedback is you're paying attention. You're invested. You understand where I want to go and who I want to be, and you're giving me the tools to get there. Feedback is an absolute function of respect.
And Brené, I think that also applies very importantly to parenting.
Oh, my God, 100%.
And I'd like you to share the story of the marble jar.
Oh, yeah, of course. One of the big myths about vulnerability is, I'm not going to be vulnerable with you until I trust you. And the irony there is, it's a chicken egg proposition. I want to trust you before I can be vulnerable with you, but I have to be vulnerable with you to earn trust. And so one of the greatest lessons I've ever learned about trust was my daughter came home from third grade and was really just crying and was so upset. And it, as I kind of heard her story, it was her first experience of betrayal. She had shared something embarrassing that had happened to her earlier in the day. And then, by lunch, all the girls in her class knew and they were laughing about it. And she was telling me about it, and she said, I'll never share my stories with anybody again. And as a parent who, I'm hurting for her, of course, my first reaction is like, damn straight. Don't tell anybody anything. Just tell me. But I knew that wasn't the answer because, we want to grow, we want to raise children who understand trust and have trusting friendships. And so she was explaining to me that the girls' behavior, the girls were laughing so much and making fun of her that Mrs. Bauckham, her third grade teacher, took marbles out of a marble jar. And they had a glass jar that whenever they made collectively good choices, the teacher would put marbles in the jar. When they made bad choices, the teacher would take marbles out of the jar. And she said, we had to have marbles taken out of our jar because the girls were being so rambunctious and, laughing about the situation. And so as I started to try to think about, how do I talk to a third grader about trust, I thought, God, the marble jar. And I said, Ellen, trust is like a marble jar. When people do something that's meaningful and trust building for you, you put marbles in their jar. We share our stories of vulnerability with our marble jar friends, with friends who we have filled up their jar. We know them, we trust them. And I asked her if she had marble jar friends, and she said, yeah, I've got a couple. And, she said, Hannah and Lorna are my marble jar friends. And I said, and this is where it got really interesting to me. I said, tell me why. And she said, and this was not what I was expecting at all. She said, well, last week when I was at my soccer game and Oma and Opa were there, who are my parents. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, Hannah looked over and said, hey, your Oma and Opa are here. And I said, yeah. And she said, I just thought it was really neat that she remembered their names and she knew they were my grandparents because she's only met them a couple of times. So that's one reason I would put marbles in someone's jar. And then she went on and gave me other examples, saving her a seat at lunch. If she missed school because she's sick, she said Lorna will always have her mom call and see how I'm doing. And it was so interesting to me because when she said, well, do you have marble jar friends, Mom? And I said, I do. And she said, well, when do you put marbles in? And I said, and I thought about it for a minute. I thought, oh my God, it's the same reason. I said, if I'm at a soccer game with my parents and one of my friends walks up and said, hey, Deanne, David, how are y'all? It's so meaningful to me that they remember that, their names and they're my parents. And so when I was finished with this, research on trust, I went into the literature because as a grounded theory researcher, we develop our theories first, then we go into the literature and see, what are other people saying about this? Because we don't want to be influenced by existing research. We want to build theories based on people's lived experiences. And more people were giving me these tiny examples of trust building. Well, when I went into literature, I found John Gottman's research on trust and betrayal. And of course, what he finds, 30 years of just groundbreaking relationship research, is that trust is built in these very small moments. These moments of I see you. He calls them sliding door moments based on that film with Gwyneth Paltrow. And he gives the example of lying in bed one night and, 10 pages away from finding out who the killer was in his great mystery novel. And he said, I didn't even want to finish it until I'd gone to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and got back in bed. And he said, I went into the bathroom and I passed my wife who was standing in front of her sink, and she looked really sad. And he said, that was that moment, because there was a part of me that just said, can I pretend to not see her and just get back in bed and finish my book? But those are the small moments of trust building. And he said, so I stopped and I took the brush from her hand and I brushed her hair and said, hey, what's going on? And so I think when we think about vulnerability and we think about trust, it's not the sweeping moments where we can do something heroic and, save somebody from something. It's these small moments. It's when I look over at my colleague and say, hey, how's your mom's chemo going? It's when I remember that, one of my colleagues, husbands, was going to, do a boat race on the weekend. And I said, hey, how did Harvey's boat race go Saturday? Those are the moments where we feel seen and known. And those are the moments that build trust. But it doesn't happen just like feedback. Trust, feedback, those conversations don't happen without vulnerability, because embedded in them are bids for connection.
Brené, as we look forward to the new year, how can we be more like the people in your study whom you label the wholehearted? What does that mean? What are their characteristics? Where do we start? And how do we maintain that behavior throughout the new year?
I think for me, wholeheartedness is about engaging with the world from a place of worthiness. It's about waking up in the morning and saying, you know what? I'm imperfect. I'm vulnerable. I'm screwing things up on a pretty regular basis. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm worthy of love and belonging, that I'm worthy of joy. It's about understanding. I think this was like a definitive moment in my life personally, as this research just kind of hit me and changed me, that most of us think about fear and courage as binary. You're either fearful or you're courageous. You're either afraid or you're brave. And I think the truth is that most of us are afraid and brave in the very same moment all day long. And I think wholeheartedness is about the willingness to say, this is who I am. And acknowledging the people in our life, this is so important, who love us, not despite our vulnerabilities and imperfections, but because of them. The people who, when we get knocked down in the arena, are willing to look at us and say, God, yeah, that sucked. But you were being brave. You were daring greatly. And I'm proud of you. As we move forward into the new year, I would say more time and attention to those people in our lives and less time and attention to the people whose opinions of us really don't matter. I think it's also important to remember that daring greatly, a lot of people say, oh, are you talking about skydiving? Are you talking about cliff jumping? The daring greatly, walking into that arena and showing up. In order to do that, when our hand is on the door of the arena and we're going to open it and walk in, we have to understand what our gremlins are. We have to understand what those shame messages are that say, hey, you're not good enough to go in there. And more importantly, when we walk in and we try something new, or we say, I love you first, or we take some risks, we have to be very careful that we don't look up into the stands and the critics that we see heckling and jeering are us. It comes back to where we started, kind of full circle, that we are our biggest supporters, that we are willing to talk to ourselves in a kind way, and that we're also willing to show up for ourselves and say, yeah, you know what? That was really vulnerable and really hard, but you were trying to be brave, and that's who we want to be.
Dr. Brené Brown, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Brené Brown. She's a research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. Her books include The Gifts of Imperfection, I Thought It Was Just Me, and her most recent book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to Be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead. Her website is BrenéBrown.com. That's BreneBrown.com. BROWN.com. You can find a link to it from our website.
We want to wish you a very happy new year from the People's Pharmacy, and we leave you with these questions. Who are your marble jar friends, and are you adding marbles to that jar? We think that's a wonderful metaphor. We also want to know that we're all showing up, and we thank you so much for listening to the People's Pharmacy each week. And we promise to reduce that shame-blame game. It's not at all productive.
No, it isn't. What's much better is to be wholehearted.
You know, we're all afraid and brave at the same time, all of the time. And we just need to accept that and accept our productive failures. We have to make mistakes to get better.
Oh, you have to make mistakes in order to learn, but you also need feedback that you have made a mistake and could do it differently.
Because feedback is total respect. Thank you so much for listening to The People's Pharmacy. Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number 800-345-7339. The website uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
Next week, we'll talk with Dr. John LaPuma, who tells us how men can reestablish proper testosterone hormone balance without taking medication. His book is Refuel, a 24-day eating plan to shed fat, boost testosterone, and pump up strength and stamina.
To order today's show with Dr. Brené Brown, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 886. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it on our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
When you go to the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show or check out our books and informational guides. At peoplespharmacy.com, you'll also find answers to your questions about common ailments, prescription medications, herbs, and home remedies.
You may also want to sign up for a free online newsletter. It comes to your inbox twice a week, or you can subscribe to the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another People's Pharmacy program again. You can also share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you so much for listening, and please do join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
When an online shopper places an order, how that package arrives matters. I'm Al Coe, the CEO of ShipStation. Our promise is to make that process as easy as possible for you. ShipStation provides a robust platform to manage everything you sell, automate manual shipping tasks, and get the lowest possible carrier rates. Keep your team and your customers happy. Go to ShipStation.com to sign up for your free trial. That's ShipStation.com.